Welcome back, everybody. It's a little warm in here, so there's not going to be any coat again. We need some air conditioning in this building, but I guess well, it's automatically controlled, and I don't have access to it. If I had access to it, it'd be 68 degrees, but I'm pretty sure it's about 80 degrees right now. All right, so let's get into our health message for this evening, resisting and fighting disease. And along the theme of last night, which was cancer fighters, and we focused on berries. Strawberries fight esophageal or throat cancer. Blackberries will fight and reverse colon cancer. And those are a couple of very big killers in our culture. So the takeaway from last night's message is berries, 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 eat a lot of them. Eat a lot of berries. They're full of phytonutrients, which are these, a lot of phytonutrients are not even identified. I mean, there's just a long list of phytonutrients. Some of them are in the category of antioxidants. But whatever the case, berries are superfoods and superheroes in the fight against disease. And tonight we're going to sort of follow along that theme and look at another really big cancer fighter. But as a reminder, let's take a look at 3 John 1:2. This is John's third letter to his church. And he says, "Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospers." So as I said last night, God desires that we not only prosper spiritually, and that means to grow in our relationship with Him, but He wants us to be healthy in body and mind. And so, in order to be healthy in body and mind, we need to take care of this machine, because how we feed it will determine whether we get sick or not, whether we get disease or not. To a large extent, 90% of cancer is preventable. But it will also affect how we think. If we eat a lot of spices, we have a tendency to get more agitated and angry. It's just a scientific fact. If we eat more spices, it violates the mucus wall of the intestine. That's why we get leaky gut, one of the reasons. And when you have a leaky gut, you have inflammation. When you have inflammation, you have irritation to the nervous system. Irritation to the nervous system affects our mood and our emotions. I know of an evangelist who did a test with his wife. They cut out all spices like mustard and cayenne and black pepper and all these things. And yes, I know cayenne has some medicinal properties, a little bit's good. But they cut out a lot of spices, or all spices, and over a period of 30 days, and they discovered that they argued less. They were more kind to each other. And there's a lot of science behind this. Our body and its condition is directly related to our mood. I mean, think about it. If you have a hangover because you did a 12-pack the night before, are you going to be sweet to everybody the next morning?
No.
Now, that's an extreme example, but it lends itself to the point I'm making. How we take care of our body, how we take care of our health, directly affects how we think and our mood. And by extension, it'll affect our inclination to pray and to spend time in the Scriptures. If we're not feeling good, if our body is struggling, well then mentally we're not feeling good. And if mentally we're not feeling good, then we're less inclined to spend time in quality prayer. So it's a good idea to take care of our bodies. Okay, so along last night's theme of cancer fighters and the superheroes in that arena, we're going to take a look at something that's a little different from berries, but it's still a superfood. It's still a superhero. And our focus is on lung cancer. Look at this graph. My goodness, look how far ahead lung cancer is over colorectal and liver and stomach and breast and esophageal, etc., etc. Lung cancer is a big deal, and as I may have said last night, if we've ever lived in a city, and that means pretty much all of us, if you've ever been stuck in a traffic jam and breathed a whole lot of fumes, if you've ever been a house painter, if you've ever been in construction, if you've ever worked in a factory, if you've ever smoked cigarettes, if you've ever smoked pot, and all smoke has carcinogens in it, your lungs have been exposed to things that changes the genetic structure of the tissue in the organ. A single cigarette at any time in your life can change enough of the DNA of enough of the cells so that at some point, even though they've been dormant for years, at some point that genetic change can manifest itself in a tumor. So all of us have been exposed to things that can cause lung cancer. I started smoking cigarettes at 14. I quit at 30. Now here's a little bit of my testimony, just a very short piece of it. I smoked cigarettes until I was 30, and you know why I quit smoking cigarettes? Well, there's 3 reasons. One, I realized it was giving me the bad migraines I have. I have a history of migraines. I started getting them when I was 5 or 6. And I realized that cigarette smoke triggers them. Still does. If I'm around cigarette smokes, I can be sure I'm probably going to have a pretty bad headache that day. The second reason is cigarettes were getting more expensive. And this was back when they were $1 a pack. Now they're like $6 or $8 a pack, $10 for some. Okay, the third part is a bit of a confession. I thought to myself, and they don't even get me high. So I used the money to buy more pot. I was brilliant, wasn't I? So I went from one burning carcinogen to another burning carcinogen. And the second one, the fringe benefit, is I was able to drop my IQ several points in the process. Anyway, here's the point. We've all been exposed to a lot of things that have made our lungs vulnerable to developing cancer of some sort. Could be asbestos in the building that we lived in as a kid, who knows. So lung cancer, it's a big problem. You don't need to smoke a whole lot of these to get cancer necessarily, as I just said, but they're probably the #1 contributor. Let's look at a few pot facts. There are 33 carcinogens in marijuana smoke, and there's a couple of various chemicals they listed. I'm not sure what PAH stands for. VOC is volatile something or another.
Organic compounds.
Thank you. I couldn't remember. Volatile organic compounds. I like that. All right. Pot smoke studies find carcinogen content similarities in the urine or cigarette, in the urine of cigarette and pot smokers. So it's very similar. It's a misspell. It should be of. So in the urine of cigarette and pot smokers, there is a similar carcinogenic content. Now this is remarkable because tobacco users inhale much more than smoke than pot users. So that tells you something about the proportion of carcinogen in pot smoke. It's extremely high. Extremely high. Because most pot smokers, it's like maybe half a joint in the morning, maybe a joint in the evening. If you're heavy, maybe it's a couple joints in a day. But a cigarette smoker might smoke 20 cigarettes. And so for them to find similar levels of carcinogens in the urine of both tells you how disproportionately high the carcinogens in pot smoke are. Pot smoke contains 50% more benzopyrene. I like these $20 words. They're very scary. And 75% more benzanthracene. I'm glad I don't make money based on how I can pronounce words. Pot smoke deposits 4-fold the amount of tar. Increased airway passage damage leading to bronchitis. So I focused a little on pot because we've legalized it and we act as if it's a benign recreational thing. I smoked pot much of my life. When I was a teenager, I dabbled with LSD and other drugs. And what I'm about to say may sound a little astounding, but I consider pot to be the most dangerous drug. And this is why. With meth, it's black and white. With heroin, it's black and white. With cocaine, it's black and white. You can see with alcohol and all these other things, the dramatic effect and the devastating effect. But you see, with marijuana, it's subtle. It's a progressive chiseling away of the IQ, a chiseling away of productive time, a chiseling away of your mental acuity, your motivation, your finances, your potential. And before you know it, 20 years have gone by and you've accomplished nothing other than sit around and perfect the art of doing bong loads. And that's why I say marijuana is the most dangerous drug today. And Satan is using it effectively. It hits the frontal lobe, which is our moral center. This is where we decide whether we're going to serve God or not. And that's where marijuana has the greatest impact. It's on the moral center in the frontal lobe. Not to mention our memory and our ability to do problem solving. So there's my little speech. Now, as far as lung cancer, here's our hero. It is broccoli. And there's a very complicated reason for why it's a superhero. There's many articles with $50 words describing how cruciferous vegetables, and namely broccoli in some of these studies, will fight lung cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, cervical cancer, colorectal cancer. It is a superhero across the board. And here's an interesting thing that I'll get to in a minute. But before that, I want to make this point. We want this and not this. Right? We want broccoli preferably raw. We don't want broccoli lathered in cheese or overcooked. Heat kills. Heat kills enzymes. Heat kills phytonutrients. If we can eat the broccoli raw, and yes, I know it'll gag you a little bit. I like to have it in small pieces with Italian herbs, sea salt, and olive oil. And yeah, it's not as fun as, a bunch of Velveeta cheese flowing over it. That's true. But sometimes there are changes we have to make in order to get the advantages of these superheroes that God has put into our gardens so that we can fight disease. So we want this, and if you steam it, that's okay. I like it steamed with a little bit of lemon sprinkled over it, with some sea salt and a little bit of olive oil. That's good stuff. I got some in my refrigerator. I'm going to have it tomorrow. So we want this. We don't want that. And here's some more study stuff, but what I want to draw your attention to is the AHR. There is a complex chemical in broccoli that directly connects to an AHR receptor in our intestines. And our intestines are the heart and soul of our immune system. And God has put something in all foods, all natural foods, but namely here, in broccoli, they have the AHR. And it's a long, complicated word that I would just massacre. But there's an AHR receptor in our intestines, as I say, that is directly related to our immune system and empowers our immune system to fight disease. And here's a pretty fancy picture that I stole from another website. And it's basically describing the interaction between different chemicals and cells in our digestive tract. And it's featuring the AHR ligands. And the trick is what is the key to activating this power booster to the immune system, so to speak? And another pretty graphic that says cruciferous vegetables. I like visual things. Now, there are several studies that talk about this and the effects it has. But I want to draw your attention to this study. Mother Nature does wonderful things. You may have heard of studies that show that plants communicate through root systems. When under is attack, it communicates to other plants in the neighborhood, I'm under attack, and so they respond chemically to defend themselves. Well, vegetables, and specifically broccoli, cruciferous vegetables, that's cabbage, Brussels sprouts, if you can handle the smell, I think those are great, and broccoli, among others. When they're being attacked from a bug and experiencing damage, they chemically react. And the interesting thing is, that chemical reaction that repels the bugs is the same thing our immune system uses when we eat the plant to fight disease. So they have found if you take broccoli and you shred it into small pieces, it thinks it's under attack. It produces these chemicals thinking it's going to repel a bug, when in reality our body can use those chemicals to bolster our immune system. So if you like broccoli, get it out first, break it up into pieces, put it in a bowl, fix the rest of your meal. When you come back to the broccoli, the chemical reaction has started and it's taking place, and you're going to experience greater benefits from the broccoli. I find that mind-blowing. I think that's just unbelievable. Isn't that unbelievable? It's just so cool, so cool. And in 1 Corinthians 3 it says, if any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. A little bit of a warning from God. We've got to take care of ourselves because our bodies are God's. They are not our own. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break and then... Okay. All right, let's get into the prophetic part of tonight's message. And as I did last night, I'm going to go ahead and kneel and pray silently for a moment. Please pray with me. Let's invite the Lord to be here. Serious subject matter. I will finish with something audible, and then we will jump into part 2, which is entitled Setting the Stage for the Antichrist. Let's bow our heads. Thank you, Lord, for hearing our prayer. I ask that you'll give me clear speech, the right cadence, clarity and pronunciation, and I pray that you'll give us all clear minds. Please show us what you want us to see. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so setting the stage for the Antichrist. We'll identify the Antichrist Monday. But I'm going to give you enough information tonight where you'll probably have a pretty good idea of who we're talking about. And in this process, I want to emphasize something because I'm afraid I might forget it later. In this process, we are identifying powers, organizations, and individuals that Satan is using. And there are many sincere Christians, many sincere innocent people, as far as what they know and understand, who are associated with these powers and individuals that we'll be looking at, who are part of God's family. So as I identify the Antichrist, the beast, the great whore of Babylon, and certain individuals who are in key powers of powerful positions, I want you to understand that though there are many people associated with these organizations and leading persons, I am not condemning or judging them. I just want to make sure that's clear for everybody here and anybody on YouTube. So let's move forward. Once again, Revelation 14, we have two groups contrasted. Saying with a loud voice in verse 7 of chapter 14 of Revelation, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment is come. Present tense, we'll talk about that. Here's the key, and worship Him who made the heaven, the earth, and the sea, and the fountains of water. In other words, worship the Creator. That's a paraphrase of the fourth commandment. And that will become significant in a couple of nights. On the other end of the spectrum, we have those who choose not to worship the Creator. And within the context of this warning, that group is a group of people who choose to receive the mark of the beast. Notice I use the word chose. Yes, there'll be coercion. There will be pressure. Just like there was on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they said, listen, fiery furnace or you bow down. They had a choice. And that's the key. We're going to have a choice. It will be a conscious choice. God is a reasonable God. He is a gentleman. He is not going to condemn anybody who ignorantly chooses the wrong team. He wants agents of free will to choose who they will serve. And yes, there may be some adversity associated with the right choice, as there has always been for God's people. But He has promised that we will not be challenged beyond what we can handle. That's a promise in the Bible. We will never be tempted beyond what we can bear. So we have two opposing groups, and the issue is worship. And of course, my batteries just ran out. So let's go ahead and change these real quick. You don't need to stop the tape.
Okay.
I should have gotten the bunny ones. Okay, there we go. So let's move on. Why is my computer not responding? There we go. Technical difficulties. I hate computers, but I use them all the time. Okay, let's do a quick review of last night's message. All Scripture is for doctrine and guidance. The Bible explains itself. God is the source of understanding. Correct worship is based on God's instructions, not ours. Which leads us to number 5. False worship is based on man-made instructions. The final test for mankind will be about worship. We must have a life surrendered to Jesus. We're going to take a look at this guy here, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And we're going to take a look at this guy here, Daniel, a Hebrew who was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar when Nebuchadnezzar sieged Jerusalem. And this Hebrew boy was made a eunuch when he was a teenager. In other words, all his private parts were chopped off. So this depiction here is not entirely accurate. I don't think a eunuch would have a beard. But nonetheless, he was faithful to God. In case you were wondering, it's because of the lack of testosterone. This gentleman here, Daniel, was humble and loyal to God. He refused to defile himself with the king's unclean food. We can read about that in Daniel 1. Because he was faithful to God, God blessed him as well as his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were given positions of power in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. They had high-ranking positions, which meant the other wise men, the Chaldeans, the sorcerers, etc., very jealous. Because these Hebrew captives were given superior positions, second and third and fourth ranking positions over natives to Babylon. But Daniel was loyal to God. And in Daniel chapter 2, we're going to take a look at a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And you may recall I said last night, this dream led to Nebuchadnezzar being a little tipped off and building a statue that was all of gold. And bowing to that statue was the test of worship. that was presented to the Hebrew boys, but they were loyal. Now, for some reason in that test that we went through last night, in the part 1 of the series, Daniel wasn't there. Some speculate it's because Nebuchadnezzar knew that Daniel would not bow, and Daniel was too valuable to Nebuchadnezzar. That's speculation. But only Daniel's 3 friends were there. Now let's go back to Daniel chapter 2, where we see the original statue, which was never built, but was part of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And as last night, I'm focused on the key verses that bring forward the subject matter that we need to be focused on. Some verses are simply listing who's there, etc., etc. Some verses will list a long list of instruments that were played in the event. We don't need to focus on those. So sometimes I will only focus on the relevant verses. So Daniel chapter 2, let's pick the story up in verse 1. And in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and sleep broke from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dreams. So Nebuchadnezzar could not remember the dreams. He wanted them not only to show him the dreams that he could not remember, but he also wants an interpretation. So they, that's the sorcerers and astrologers, etc., etc., came and stood before the king. Let's pick it up in verse 4. Then spake the Chaldeans, who is among this group of counselors, to the king in Syriac. That's their original language, their native language. The Chaldeans were actually like the Hebrews in that they were a conquered people. And these Chaldeans said, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. So you can see what's happening here. The Chaldeans, the sorcerers, the astrologers, they know, I have no idea what he dreamed. If he could just tell us, we'll make something up. All right? That's pretty much how fortune tellers work. Of course, Satan will sometimes lead them to have a certain amount of accuracy, because a con job isn't effective unless there's some truth that can be conveyed. Verse 5, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. In other words, I can't remember the dream. If you will not make it known unto me the dream, with the interpretation thereof, so the king wants to know the dream and the interpretation, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. The king was apparently really stressed about this. He wanted to know, what's my dream? What does it mean? Because it apparently was those dreams apparently had a very serious impact on him. Verse 6. But if you show me the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards, great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. They, that is his counselors, answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation thereof.
We don't have a clue.
They don't have a clue.
Right.
The king answered and said, I know of a certainty that you would gain the time. He's saying, you're trying to stall. You're buying time. You're hoping this will become less important to me. Because you see the thing is gone from me. You can tell. I can't remember it. But this is how, ultimately, I'm going to test if you really the people you say you are. They sell it and say they can interpret things, do fortune telling and all this. Okay then, tell me what the dream was to begin with. Now, they could not tell the king, and they went on to say, it is a rare thing that the king requireth, and there is none other that can show it before the king, except for the gods whose dwelling is not on earth. So these guys are saying, listen, there's only one way you can find out, and that's if God tells you. And this is an important part of the story. For this cause the king was angry and very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And that would have included Daniel and his friends, because they were part of this team of counselors. But they weren't called initially for some reason. That was divine providence, because God had a plan. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. So their heads were on the chopping block as well. Then Daniel went in, starting at verse 16, then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, and that he would show the king the interpretation. Right there it shows that the king valued Daniel. He was ready to massacre the guys that were in his court that did show up. They probably did get killed. They were there already. The soldiers probably went whack, 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 whack. And they were about to move on the ones that did not show up at that time. But you can see in verse 16, the king had a lot of respect for Daniel and his friends. So Daniel was able to get this request. Give me some time. Verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hannah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are the Hebrew names for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That they would desire mercies of God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. God had mercy on them. God had this all planned. He wanted Nebuchadnezzar to see, listen, there's a God in heaven, that's me. Daniel and his companions are my guys, and this is the only way you're going to get an answer. So God had a plan here. So he goes before the king, and this is where we pick it up in verse 26, the explanation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name is Belshazzar. Belshazzar is related to the Babylonian king. See, when Nebuchadnezzar took them captive, he wanted to recreate them in every way possible, and that included changing their names. The names had an implication related to the pagan god. The original names in Hebrew were related to the true God. Names mean something in Scripture. And the king says to Daniel, or Belshazzar, art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen and the interpretation thereof? Daniel goes on to say in verse 28, and this is important because Daniel gives God the credit. He says, there is a God in heaven that reveals dreams, secrets rather, and makes known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and thy vision of thy head upon the bed are these. Notice Daniel gave credit to God. That's important. Thou, O king, sawest and beheld a great image. The great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. In other words, it was impressive. This image's head was of gold, his breasts and arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them in pieces. Now I want to point out something that's important here. Because what we just read flies in the face of the two most common belief systems when it comes to biblical prophecy. Most people are in the book of in the camp of either being a preterist or a futurist. A preterist says all prophecy has been accomplished. There's nothing more to consider. A futurist says it is all, at least most of it, is in the future, and we don't need to worry about it today because there's not really anything going on today. It's going to be in the future. We have to look forward to see who the Antichrist is. We have to look forward to find out who the beast is, etc., etc. But you see, we just read something that contradicts that and points out that there's only one correct view of biblical prophecy, and that's called the historicist perspective. In other words, it is an unfolding over the historical timeline. We see that this is taking place in Babylon, and we will find shortly that Babylon is represented as the head of gold. It moves forward to Medo-Persia, and we'll see that in a moment. And then it moves on to Greece, and then it moves on to Rome, and then it moves on to divided Rome. And this stone that is cut out without hands, the without hands means that it is of divine origin, and Jesus is the rock. And that's the future part of this dream or vision. So it's an unfolding over time. From Daniel's perspective, he was standing in the head of gold, and the Medo-Persians, which were the silver, and the Greeks, which were the brass, and the Romans, which were the iron, were still future. For us, most of that is past. So what we're looking at is an unfolding of prophecy over time. It is not all future, it is not all past. It is moving along. And we are at the end of it, but there's still some future. But a lot of it's past. And some of it's taking place right now. Let's move on. Verse 35. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, the gold broken to pieces together. That's because of the rock, which had a divine origin, came and destroyed it. Let's read on. And became like chaff of the summer threshing folds. In other words, when they thresh the wheat, the really light husks fly into the air and just drift away like dust. And the wind carried them away, and no place was found for them. In other words, these kingdoms were no longer existed, which is what's going to happen when Jesus returns. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So the kingdoms of the world will be demolished and removed, but God's kingdom will be established and take the place of those. Daniel goes on to say, this is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Verse 37, Thou, O king, art the King of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. Babylon was the head of gold. And after thee shall arise another kingdom. So we see these metals represent kingdoms. After thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things, and as iron that breaks all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And we'll look into what all that verbiage right there actually means in a moment. And Monday night. Verse 41. And whereas thou sawest the feet and the toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of strength of iron, forasmuch as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so shall the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken, or partly weak. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seeds of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. That's actually a piece of European history. And this is what we're talking about, and I want to bring out a couple of very important points that would become more and more important as we go on in this series. We're moving east to west. Babylon. Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. That'll become important in a couple of lectures. The unfolding of history is from east to west. Here it's talking about, verse 43, how the results of the Roman Empire, because let's back up. Rome is represented by the iron, but it's fragmented into 10 toes in the feet that are both strong and weak. This is Europe. This is what came out of conquered Rome. And the history of Roman, or rather European nations has been, here, you king over there, you have your son marry my daughter over here, and if they get married, we're not going to fight, and we're going to be partners. And that's what they're talking about here. Whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. What does the seed in the Bible mean? We're talking about the seed of life and reproduction. It's common. That's a common phraseology. And this is what happened. Rome came undone. The result was North Africa, Western Middle East, Palestine, but primarily Europe were the 10 fragments of Rome coming apart. And afterward, with all the wars and the feuding, they started marrying their children off to each other, hoping to consolidate. We've had a series of attempts to consolidate Europe. The Kaiser tried it, Napoleon tried it, Hitler tried it. They tried it with the European Union, and now Britain's out. So the prophecy has come true. They tried to mix, but they never accomplished it. Let's move on. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up the kingdom. So at some point, remember the last stage here is the European nations, the 10 toes. The 10 is very important. At some point, the Lord will return and they will be eliminated. It says here in 44, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. God is not coming back to take the United States or some other nation and say, I'm going to take what you got and make it better. A lot of Americans think that. There's nothing biblical about that at all. Daniel 2 makes it clear. When the Lord returns, all the kingdoms of the world are going away and God's kingdom is taking over. But you'll hear one person after another on YouTube say, America's God's nation. I'm going to show you quite the opposite is true. Unfortunately. I'm a patriotic person. I come from a military family. I don't like that idea. 45, verse 45, Daniel 2, for as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, in other words, it had divine origin, and that it brake in pieces in iron and brass and clay and silver and the gold, and the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain and the interpretation thereof is sure. Babylon ruled from 605 to 539 BC. Medo-Persia conquered Babylon and ruled from 539 BC to 331 BC. Greece under Alexander the Great conquered the Persians. They were pretty much what was left of that alliance at that time. He ruled, or rather the Greeks ruled, and eventually it was actually his 4 leading generals after he died, because he died young. They ruled from 331 to 168 BC. Pagan ruled from 168 BC to 476 AD, and then when pagan Rome fell apart, papal Rome rose up. It was ruled under the Bishop of Rome, and that ruled from 538 AD to 1798 AD, and we'll look at biblical proof for those dates. All of it is historical fact, but we need biblical proof for the last component. And we'll take a look at that. Huh? So basically this is what came out of the Roman Empire. We had the Vandals in North Africa, we had the Visigoths, which ended up being the Spaniards. The Suebi ended up being the Portuguese. We got the Franks, ended up being the French. The Anglo-Saxons, that's a term that's still familiar, that British, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so this is basically what the result was of Rome coming apart. The 10 toes, represented in 10 regions that formed immediately after the breakdown of the Roman Empire. Now, let's move to Daniel 7. As I said last night, Daniel in prophecy, it states and restates with more information. So we got Daniel chapter 2 gives us a basic breakdown using metals to represent nations. Gives us a little bit of detail. Daniel 7, gives us much more detail, and then Daniel 8 will give us even more detail. But it's the same prophecy with additional detail. It's simply repeat and amplify. Is what Daniel does in chapters 2, 7, and 8. So looking at Daniel 7, starting in verse 2, verse 1 identifies who is king at the time. Daniel 7:2. Daniel spake and said, I saw my vision by night. So Daniel is given a vision in his sleep. And behold, the four winds represent a couple of different things. Strife, war, in certain contexts, the 4 directions of the compass. But we can see here it's actually strife in the form of war. And behold, the four winds of heaven strove upon the great sea. Now, in Bible prophecy, sea and water represents populated areas. That's on the handout that you received last night. So when we see in prophecy a mention of sea or waters, we're talking about a populated area. So Daniel is saying, in the populated area of the world, which in the context here was Babylon, there was war. Now that's important because we're going to talk about unpopulated areas that are referred to as earth as opposed to sea. So here, great sea, populated area. And the four great beasts, notice now, before we had four metals defining nations, now we have four great beasts that are going to define the same nations. This tells us that the word beast, a creature symbol, represents a nation, and that applies to the beast with the infamous mark. So we need to find a nation or a kingdom that has the right descriptors, and he's going to have that mark that everybody talks about. And no, it's not 666. Let's read on. The four great beasts came up from the sea, a populated area. And we can see that by looking at the previous slide, that this was indeed the populated area of the world. This is the densest populated part of the world that is relevant to biblical timelines. Daniel goes on to describe what he saw. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Babylon's symbol, icon, mascot was a lion with wings. It was on their walls, and parts of those walls are in several museums in the world, including one in Chicago. I went there and personally saw it. So Babylon's symbol is a lion with wings. I beheld till the wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand up upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second, like a bear, and raised up upon itself on one side, and it had three ribs in the mouth of it between the teeth, and they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. Now, Babylon was conquered by Medo-Persia. In chapter 2, we have the two arms, chest of silver, the alliance of Medes and Persians. Originally, they were more or less in equal partnership. Here in Daniel 7, we have a bear that is raised up on one side. Initially, it was more or less equal, the Medes actually having a little bit of dominance, but over time, the Persians were the dominant force in this alliance, and the Medes basically disappeared. By the time Alexander the Great came along, all you hear about is really the Persians. So that's why we have the two arms that moved to a bear that was lopsided, because the alliance between the Medes and the Persians became unbalanced. It was all about the Persians after a very short period of time. It had three ribs in the mouth. How does a bear devour? With its mouth. It tears things apart with its mouth. Yes, I know it uses its claws as well, but here there's some symbolic meaning. It had three ribs. Why? The Medes and Persians had three major conquests, among a few minor ones. They conquered Lydia, they subdued Egypt, and they wiped out Babylon. The three ribs in its mouth, an uneven alliance, which is why the bear is raised up. Next, in verse 8, I beg pardon, 6. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it four wings of a fowl. The beast had also four heads, and dominion was given to it. This is Greece. It took out the Persians. It was still Medo-Persia, but the Persians, like I said, basically had dominance. That's why the bear is raised up on one side. Now, leopard is a fast animal. Alexander the Great, when he took power, he was a very young man, and you can read one book after another about how he just came in and he wiped out his opponents as if they were nothing. He flew through them like a leopard, moving quickly. So fast, in prophecy they add the 4 wings of a falcon, designating even greater speed. Alexander the Great came in with his army and just wiped out the opponents, like I said, blazingly fast. Now here's what's interesting. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Alexander the Great died as a young man. And we'll see in chapter 8, it actually addresses that specifically, and I'll point it out. He dies as a young man, but he had 4 leading generals that took over, and Greece was diced up into quarters, out of one of which the Roman Empire came. That's why it says 4 heads. There were 4 generals that took over after Alexander the Great died. It is said that when he was on his deathbed, they asked him, who's going to take over? And he said, to the strongest. I don't know if that's true or not, but ultimately he had 4 leading generals that ended up dicing up the Greek kingdom. Let's move on. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, this is Rome, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. Rome is known as the Iron Kingdom. It devoured and brake in pieces. It was vicious when it conquered, and stamped the residue with its feet. This is a reference to being a persecuting power. We'll look more into that. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Remember, Rome had 10 divisions, the 10 toes in chapter 2. Here it has 10 horns. And once again, in the handout that I gave last night, we'll find that horns represent smaller kingdoms or attributes of greater kingdoms. So we had 10 toes and 2 with the metals. Now we have beasts, and here it has 10 horns that came out of the last beast, which was Rome, the 10 divisions that resulted from Rome coming undone. This is Daniel speaking. Pick it up in verse 8. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Antichrist power. And we'll go on to explain why that's the case. Let's back up. I considered the horns, the 10 divisions of Rome, and behold, there came up among them another little horn. Our first identifier. It comes out of Rome. After Rome comes apart. Before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. This little horn power is later described as being more stout than his fellows. So this little horn power grows in strength and ends up eliminating 3 of the original 10 toes or horns. We'll see the historical evidence to support that Monday night. It's just a matter of history. And behold, in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of man. This is a reference to human wisdom, which is contrary to God's wisdom. And a mouth speaking great things. We will find that these great things are blasphemous things. Pompous things. Things spoken against the God of heaven. So we have some identifiers for this power. It's a little horn that comes up among the 10. It gets rid of 3 of the original 10. It has the wisdom of man as opposed to the wisdom of God, and it speaks blasphemous things. Now verses 9 through 14 is a parenthetical segue away from this timeline, more or less, where Daniel describes the great judgment scene in heaven. So what this tells us is sometime after Rome falls And this little horn power comes to be that there's going to be a judgment, which is why in Revelation 14 it says judgment is come. Present tense. Because it comes after the fall of Rome. And it has something to do with what takes place after this little horn rises. And once again, I will reiterate, this little horn is the Antichrist power. Great things, blasphemous. Eyes of a man, wisdom of man as opposed to wisdom of God. We'll see in history the clear evidence that it uprooted 3 of the original divisions of Rome. Let's move on. Back into the primary vision, Daniel chapter 7. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near unto one of them that stood by. In other words, this dream, this vision was being facilitated by a heavenly being, and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made me know the interpretation of the things. These great beasts, which are 4 kings, or kingdoms, because these kingdoms have more than one king. Right? We find Babylon, in Daniel's account, there was more than one Babylonian king. We find in Daniel's account there was more than one Medo-Persian king addressed. All right? So we're talking about kingdoms. Then I would know, this is Daniel speaking again, then I would know the truth of the 4th beast. That really grabbed his attention. But his attention is really drawn to that little horn, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron and his nails of brass. Notice Rome had inherited some of the Greek philosophy. That's true. In their religion, they had inherited some of the Greek philosophy, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue of his feet. Notice again that this Roman power is oppressive. It stomps. This is denoting persecution. And of the 10 horns, Daniel is going on to address what he finds interesting, and he's getting a response from the heavenly being. He goes on to say, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other that came up, and 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes, and a mouth that spake very great things. Notice this, whose look was more stout than his fellows. So this little horn power that comes up among the 10 and speaks blasphemous words, comes out of the Roman divisions. It is little initially, but then here it says more stout than his fellows. So this little horn becomes powerful. So we're looking at things that are describing something that came out of Rome and did these things and had these attributes. All the reformers knew that this was the Antichrist. And we will show you how and why tonight, but mostly Monday night. Let's read on in Daniel chapter 7, verse 21. I beheld in the same horn, this is the little horn, made war with the saints. It's a persecuting power. It's a Roman power, and it kills God's people. Verse 23. Thus he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the earth, and shall tread it down, and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise, that's the little horn, after them. So we've got Rome, it comes apart, has 10 divisions. Eventually, this little horn comes up. It becomes more stout, eliminates 3 of the original 10, and it is also known as a power that makes war with God's people. So let's look at a visual representation of that. Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 had of gold the lion with wings. Chests and arms, silver. The bear raised up on one side because it was an uneven alliance. That's Medo-Persia. Greece, which was the brass, was a leopard, which was very fast, just like Alexander the Great's battles. It had 4 heads. It ended up being diced up in 4 sections among the 4 generals. We have Rome that took out Greece. It had 10 toes eventually. Over here it has 10 horns. And in the middle of that eventually comes up this little horn power that grows to be more stout than its peers. And it becomes more stout because of the power that it wields. Here's a table equivalent to what we just saw visually. You have gold, flying eagles, wings, chest and arms of silver, meat of Persia, bear, belly and thighs of brass, Greece, leopard, 4 heads, legs of iron, Rome, dreadful beast, feet of 10 toes of iron and clay in Daniel chapter 2. Those are the divisions of Rome until present, minus the 3. And then we have the 10 horns. Daniel 8. It's going to give us more information, but it's repeating the same vision. But here's the interesting thing. It doesn't even mention Babylon. Why? Because by the time Daniel got this vision, Babylon had been conquered by the Medo-Persians, and he was now counselor to the Medo-Persian king. Once again, verifying what I said earlier, all prophecy was not in the future or the past, it's ongoing. So now we see in Daniel, Babylon is gone, so here in Daniel 8, it just picks it up with the Medo-Persia power. And it used beasts again, but it used different beasts and gives us additional attributes. Let's pick it up in verse 3. Then I lifted up my eyes, this is Daniel speaking, and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, so this represents Medo-Persia, which had 2 horns. Medo-Persia. The Medes, the Persians. Just like the bear raised up on one side. And notice, it says here, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. Those were the Persians. And the higher came up last. And that's exactly what happened. They were more or less equal. And then the Persians took dominance. And then it became the higher horn, or the raised up side of the bear. Initially, it was just 2 equal arms. Verse 4, I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward. It was conquering, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And that's what happened with the Medes and Persians. Just read history. Verse 5, and as I was considering, behold, a he-goat. Now this is Greece. From the west, remember we're moving from east to west. Remember that? That'll become important soon. The he-goat from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground. Have you ever seen a cartoon where the character's going so fast it's not even touching the ground? Remember the leopard, a very fast animal with wings. And I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west, which means it's moving east, on the face of the earth and touched not the ground. It was moving fast. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. What was that notable horn, anybody? Alexander the Great. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, that was Medo-Persia, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in fury of his power, which is exactly how Alexander the Great conquered. And I saw him close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler, that's anger and hatred against him, and smote the ram and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. That was absolutely the truth. That was absolutely the truth. Alexander the Great, with his armies, he trashed the Persians. Therefore the he-goat, that is the Greeks, waxed very great. That's indeed true. And he was strong, and the great horn, that's Alexander the Great, was broken. He died when he was a young man. And it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. That was the 4 generals that took over Greece after Alexander the Great died. And out of one of them came forth a little horn. Out of them what? Out of one of the 4 divisions of Greece. One of them being Europe. Remember, we're moving from east to west. Also notice, Rome is not even mentioned. The little horn is seen as synonymous with the Roman power. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great. It was little, became more stout, like the other verse said, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. Pleasant land would be Palestinian area. Yea, he magnified himself even to the Prince of Hosts. These are more identifiers for that little horn, which is the Antichrist. He, that's the little horn, magnified himself to the Prince of the Host. Who's the Prince of Heaven? And by him the daily, the word in italics is inserted. It's not in the original scripture. And by him the daily is a reference to the worship service of God. The worship service of God is referred to as the daily. The word sacrifice is in italics for a reason. It's because it was supplied by the translators. But it doesn't change the meaning. I just want to point out that this little horn who magnified himself against God, against Jesus Christ, and by him the daily, that's the worship of God, was taken away. So this power does something to remove valid worship. Remember, we've been talking about how it's all about worship. And the place of the sanctuary was cast down. Now here's another key point. And I know a lot of this is difficult to put together. But Monday night we'll put all those pieces nicely together. Right now, I simply want to plant the imagery in our heads so we have an idea of what the attributes of the little horn, who is the Antichrist, is. And then Monday we're going to draw it all together. And by him the daily, that's the worship of God, was taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. God's place of worship is violated in some way. And a host, that is an army in the Bible, was given to this little horn. A host, that's an army, was given him against the daily sacrifice. An army was given to this little horn against the worship of God. And we'll see how history addresses this beautifully. Reading on towards the end, and it cast down the truth to the ground. What does the Bible say is truth? Thy word is truth. So this little horn power that came out of Rome cast down the Bible. It cast down the truth. And it practiced and prospered. So this little horn power became really powerful. So like before, we have parallels between Babylon being gold, the line, and Daniel 8. It's not mentioned because it's already been conquered by the Medo-Persians by now. We have the silver chest, Medo-Persia, the bear raised up on one side. We have the ram with two horns, but one horn was longer, just like the bear was raised up on one side, just like the Persians were dominant in history. We have the Greeks, the brass, the leopard, very fast, 4 heads, the 4 generals that took over from Alexander the Great. That was the he-goat with the notable horn, but that notable horn was broken. Alexander the Great died when he was young. You have Rome, which was an ugly creature, fracturing into 10 toes, 10 horns, and in Daniel 8, it goes straight to the little horn. And in context, that little horn is more or less considered synonymous with Rome. Okay. Every time I get this notice, it freezes my machine. Here we go. Okay, conclusions. In Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we find 4 superpowers, starting with Babylon, that set the stage for the Antichrist power. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome are the 4 superpowers. And today's Europe is the remaining fragments of that Roman superpower. In Daniel chapter 7, out of the 10 divisions, or smaller kingdoms, of the Roman Empire rises another power, that's the little horn. And this little horn persecutes the saints. It's given an army, and we'll show how that was the case. It's blasphemous. It challenges the truth. Point 4. This little horn power is blasphemous, persecuting power, as I just said. This is the Antichrist power. On Monday, we will add to these descriptions, to these identifiers. We will see quotes from the little horn power himself. We will see quotes from all the reformers who will be in perfect harmony with what I will tell you. And we will know who the Antichrist is, without question. Because there is only one power, only one individual that can qualify. There is none other that has all these descriptors that identify this entity. But as I said last night, without Jesus, all of this prophecy doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't mean much. So I want to encourage everybody hearing my voice, whether tonight or sometime down the line. The most important thing is get your heart lined up with Jesus. Get your life lined up with Jesus. And you'll be able to stand when this Antichrist power flexes his arms yet again. The next meeting is entitled The Birth of the Antichrist. And I will identify exactly who we're talking about. The reformers will identify him. History will identify him. And the Antichrist power himself, by his own words, will condemn himself. Let's bow our heads. Gracious Father in heaven, we ask that you will please help us to understand the truths that you have put in the Scripture for us to know in these last days. The Bible makes it clear that many are called, but few are chosen. And that's because few will accept the truth. And it has, as has almost always been the case, among those who claim to be your people, the majority will indeed not be, and the majority will indeed be wrong, and the majority will indeed betray you, just as Judas did. Help us to be among the minority that accepts the difficult truths, that surrenders our lives to you, and is willing to go wherever the Lamb leads. Please take everyone home safely. Please bring us back together safely Monday night. In Jesus' name.